Hello, I'm Sarah Tremlett. I'm the author of the Poetics of Poetry Film by Intellect Books and the University of Chicago Press. I'm very pleased that it's part of the Athens Videopoetry Festival this year. So thank you, Sissy, for that. I'm being interviewed by Dr. Meriel Lland on the book with some very interesting questions which cover the history of the genre in detail, the different forms of poetry film and how they relate across, particularly in terms of philosophical thinking, and also with the different voices of the different practitioners who are leading the field today. I'm also really pleased that the book will be part of the Film Poem website, where different genres will be featured across the board, from digital media to theatre to installation to poetry film, etc., as academic resources. And I think this is a wonderful and vital concept for artists all around the world to come to the site and see what's going on. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that progresses into the future. Thank you very much once again, and good luck with the festival.
Hello everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with Sarah Tremlett today about her groundbreaking new book, The Poetics of Poetry Film. This visionary volume is the book that I most needed to have by my side when I began my adventures in poetry film. So today we're going to discuss the book and show a few examples of films selected by Sarah to illustrate key ideas. So what makes this volume so very important? Well, as a poetry filmmaker, I've been working in the field, like so many other poets and filmmakers, screening films at festivals and keeping up with the online conversations on the genre. Essential to my learning have been websites such as Liberated Words, which Sarah co-directs with spoken word poet Lucy English, Moving Poems, Poetry Film Live, and Poetry Film Canal. But there was never just one place to which I could turn to think through that which I was discovering. And this became especially important when my own students were looking to explore poetry film. There are just very few books on the subject, and certainly none that offered a global survey of the medium and its roots. Author, artist, poetry filmmaker and theorist Sarah Tremlett has spent 5 years writing and compiling the Poetics of Poetry Film. The book itself is over 400 pages long and includes an amazing 60 colour and 20 black and white images. And whilst it provides in-depth information on all aspects of the subject, it reads like an organic narrative and is immensely accessible for makers and students of poetry and film, art historians, digital media practitioners, the general public, and those with the desire to explore the potential of a truly hybrid and expansive form. So now we have a book that traces the threads of origins, anatomizes poetics, and, including over 40 contributors, also provides a platform for makers to discuss motivations and cultural understandings. So welcome, Sarah, and thank you for talking with us today. Could we start by asking you where your journey into poetry film and into this encyclopedic and extraordinary book began?
Thank you, Meriel, for that really lovely introduction. I began as a painter in my 20s, and I became interested in the way that the moving image can be combined with words and how poetry on the page gets affected by movement on screen. I was exhibiting and writing on the arts, and also working in publishing, which I still do. I also trained as a textile designer, and so I have a feel for the screen, both as a repetitive form and also a fixed frame. I also was working as a performance artist with photographers, and had a stage play produced in America. So with all these very different aspects to my artistic life, they all seem to fit into the multimedia aspect of poetry film. And then I had children, I began working with video, and I liked the immediacy of this, like even as a diary form. Then I made narrative films, and then I worked more experimentally on a research project with contemplative short texts, looking at how verse form on the page can be replicated on screen in terms of the cyclical turning and the metronomic repetition. This was in 2006. I was also reading lots of books on concrete poetry, graphic poetics, etc. And I carried on in this way until I met Lucy English in 2010. We began Liberated Words to screen poetry films in 2012. And I knew then I wanted to provide a guide to the subject, because people asked me about it. And I thought, yes, that's what I want to do, is to share everything I'm discovering on my journey. So in reality, I've actually spent around 15 years developing my thoughts on this subject. I've read over 250 books related to the genre. And what I feel is really important is the fact that this is a marriage of practice and theory. I haven't just written from a detached perspective. I'm a working artist.
"250 books. Yes, that's a very healthy bibliography. But let's go back to basics for a moment. Could you maybe tell us what poetry films are, please, and give us a sense of a definition of the term as you apply it in the book?
A poetry film is a genre of short film that typically combines poetry, either spoken or as text on screen or both, with the moving image and a soundscape, although it doesn't have to have a soundscape. There were early examples of poetry films, but weren't known as such at the time, at the beginning of the silent film era, when large companies experimented with the short form, the short film, and added poetry to it as a form of script, as intertitles. One of these examples is The Night Before Christmas by Clement Clarke Moore, but made by the Edison Manufacturing Company in 1906. In 1921, the American lyric documentary film Manhattan was created and included poetry by Walt Whitman. Whilst there are random examples of this form, mainly it was the cinematic poem as cited by the futurists, and then the film poem that artists such as Man Ray created in Paris in the 1920s, that went on and became the most popular, and it was known for working just with light and rhythm rather than the word itself. It was Marcel Duchamp who created an extraordinary departure from the film poem in the film Anemic Cinema, which is arguably the first example of an experimental poetry film. I have argued that this film, with its rotating punning texts, with alliterative sound words, obviously meant to affect the unconscious, as the surrealists were interested in. This to me is the first example of the cyclical turning that happens when of the verse on the page, but transposed to the filmic medium. A video poem as two words came into being with the rise of video itself, and in 1968 the film Wheel of Light or Road of Lume by the Portuguese father of the genre, Ernesto Manuel de Melo e Castro, was created, and really the first film of its kind. Herman Berlant went on to create a poetry film festival in the 1970s, and here he brought forward the word in film to emphasize the poetry in film rather than a lyric poetic film without words. The term video poem as one word was created by Tom Convis at the end of the 1970s or the early 1980s to define a particular type of work where the poem itself is not a separate self-contained form illustrated by a film, but that the blending of the words and the image and the soundscape all create the poem or text. The film itself is the poem, distinct from a vehicle for a poem on the page. Of course, artists work between these categorizations and often switch. You switch between one or another according to how you're working with other people or not, etc.
Fascinating. So the term itself, like the form, is quite contentious, or maybe under construction. Your practice as research underpins everything. You're asking questions the maker asks of their material and of others as they work. Perhaps this would be a really good point for you to describe the scope of the book.
Well, this book centres on the how of poetry film, the forms of poetry film from all different makers around the world. And in that sense, it is timeless. It can be applied today or in 5-10 years' time. It is divided into 3 parts, where I am the main author, contributions from other artists, and an overview of different narrative types. It includes historical context from way back in the pre-Christian era to the early days of silent film, of course, to documentary, experimental and broadcast poetry filmmakers, right up to the present day, and of course the rise of festivals. At the same time, it cites the early theorists who have debated approaches to visual text or poetry, but also brings forward others who have not been discussed before.
Yes, you certainly have developed a vibrant new theories in relation to the subject. I can clearly see that.
I also focus on contemporary pioneers, largely from the beginning of this century, who came to prominence at the beginning of this century. And I also discuss narrative forms such as eco-poetry films and collections. There are poetry film collections just as there are poetry collections. What is central to this book, though, is the importance of lyric subjectivity and the author's voice, and an often underlying approach that is philosophical in practice. It was also important that artists have contributed in their own words. It is fascinating to see how individual filmmakers, such as, for example, Alistair Cook Suzanne Weidner or Adele Myers or Mark Nays approach their practice. I'm really indebted to Thomas Zandegiacomo del Bel from Zebra for his worldwide coverage of filmmakers who have been screened at the festival over the years, and Charles Olsen for his revealing interviews with Spanish video poets. Also, Marisol Bellusci's very interesting background to how video poetry in Argentina arose out of such a political situation in the country, and how VideoBardo in Buenos Aires is the longest running video poetry festival in the world.
Absolutely. I think the contributions by Thomas and Charles really give an in-depth overview of the subject. And the book features many types of poetry film and films with radically different agendas.
Of course, poetry films may be quiet and reflective and slow, but this is not always the case. In fact, there are many types of poetry film, as you will see in the book. For example, some follow the page format of the video of the haiku as video haiku or haiban. Some can be a series of still images, whilst also, of course, being live footage or animation, perhaps in documentary form. Some are humorous and some are very, very serious. Humour comes from the music in Mary Craven's A Poem for Rent, with the poetry by Kim Mannix, where a poem is compared to renting a property. And the boppy music and the still images and the way they are put together gives us an amusing approach to that subject. Whereas in contrast, in the poetry film by Alfred Marseille and Jan Beek, we see refugees walking through a European village in the rain with hardly any sound at all, and literally giving us the feeling of being at the border, which is the title of the film.
Now, refugees fleeing war and their country are mostly heading to Europe in search of a better life. But they're seemingly doomed to suffer wherever they're going. It is received evidence that some unaccompanied child refugees have been sexually exploited. However, some of the children are not lucky enough to reach Europe. On Saturday, nearly 40 people drowned after the boat sank in the Aegean Sea while trying to reach Greece from Turkey. Turkey's coast starts to provide dead bodies of children in the and disgusting like babies and threatening to give the asylum seekers, quote, the punishment they deserve. Elsewhere in the British city of Dover, clashes erupted between opponents and supporters of refugees. The police, who were stuck in the middle of the fight, made several arrests from both sides. The anti-refugee protesters rallied after calls by far-right groups, including the Southeast Alliance, the National Front, and Northwest Infidels. But an anti-refugee sentiment is growing across Europe. The German Chancellor has defended her open-door policy towards asylum seekers.
It is incomprehensible to me that a European Union with 500 million inhabitants cannot take in, for example, 1 million Syrians, whereas a country with 5 million inhabitants like Lebanon is managing it. That does not give a good impression of our content. We speak about our values everywhere, but we are not prepared to do our part. And Syria is not on the other side of the equator.
Could you tell us a little bit more about how you brought this wide-ranging material together for the book? And perhaps a sense too of your discoveries?
Yes, I would say that my main contribution to this field is to really look in depth at different parts of the poetry film, whether it be voice or time or rhythm, the tonality, music, texture, whether a film is in black and white, etc., 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 and all how this relates to narrative or not, as the case may be. I don't have time today to go into all aspects of this subject, but just to focus on the voice for a moment. Of course, in relation to other types of short film, the voice comes into its own in the poetry film, and it has an exciting role, not only as a sound source, but for the subjectivity of the poet, of whoever is speaking, whoever has written the poem. Of course, they don't have to be speaking the actual poem. And whilst we can think of the register of the voice, of the intonation in a spoken poem, now we can add in soundscape and visuals that not only extend metaphor and intonation, but might qualify or juxtapose the voice and content and add exciting differences. A poem can be in different languages, where translation of the words themselves creates another layer of associations. Also, there is the psycholinguistic register. It can be almost as if an inner voice is speaking, a lyric voice, where you just hear a voiceover close to your ear. You don't see anybody on screen, and they could be contemplating a very personal issue, often thinking back to a past event. Or it can be addressed as a form of protest. A person on screen, a protagonist actually speaking to you in a direct way. There are many forms of voice. There are examples of the inner voice in the Spanish film Viento, or Wind. We can hear the voiceover and also see the elements he discusses. So it is a combination of two of both being an inner voice and observation. But in this short film, which is in black and white, we feel the sense of a memory. Each shot has been framed very closely and clearly, and it really conveys the feeling of the voice and the subject. Another example of an inner voice is Dave Richardson's, any of Dave Richardson's work, really.
Lo vi cuando era niño, y tal como lo vi, lo recuerdo. Un día abriré la boca y callarán las ranas. La gangrena había afinado bien su trabajo. Iba desprendiéndose a trozos la cordura. A saber dónde. A saber dónde. No bastaba aquella señal atada en el dedo para devolver a la memoria el deber de ser felices. Debieron de reconocerme aquella vez las nubes. Rendido, huérfano, a la deriva. De esa grieta en mi cabeza se escapan pensamientos de otro, apilados en el vacío como cadáveres que la tierra escupe. Retornando a veces en sueños de entre las páginas de un libro casual para asegurarme una muesca, un hito, una rodera que marque, llegado el momento, el camino de vuelta a casa.
A film that I often come back to is Greenspin by eco-poet Helen Moore and filmmaker Howard Vors. It is a fine example of both a performative poetry film and one that has a strong underlying message. It shows that humour can underpin a very serious message, and indeed it is so memorable as a film, combining animation and live footage with the music, that perhaps it's one of my almost favourite poetry films of all time.
Profit margins down. Got a product or brand that you'd like to green up?
Here at Greenspin PR, we have the solution that's right for you. With our unique service, we can make your product look as if you care.
We're expert in the use of unsubstantiated language that puts the consumer's mind at ease.
And we can do this even when there's absolutely no proof.
Leave it to us to certify your product eco-friendly.
Don't worry, we'll focus on trivia that distracts attention from the bigger issues.
And you can rely on us to throw in some feel-good factors, or perhaps a little guilt inducement, to make your brand or product the next essential purchase.
How alive are you?
Great performance with great emissions.
From Greenwash, a user's manual. When it's that really tough, competitive edge you're after, Just front load your business into our new green washing machine. It takes all kinds, and at high or low temperatures will tackle the most stubborn campaigns, offsetting your conscience instantly. Top results, our guarantee. Our washer uses only the most charismatic of powders, and will even take delicates like oil companies, airlines and car manufacturers, creating a soft soap screen, a turncoat of iridescent suds in which your CEO can parade, transparent on the stock exchange. Not that this is the Emperor's new clothes. After a rinse with softener, for that added shareholder comfort, and plenty of extra spin, your business will be newly laundered. It can then be hung out to dry for that natural fresh air scent. You, secure in the knowledge that it's had a cleaner, greener type of wash.
For me, one of the most interesting aspects of poetry film is the way that the oral rhythms and the visual rhythms work together. In my own film, Mr. Sky, with poetry by Lucy English, the subject is an uncertain relationship between a couple reflected in the colours of the sky. For this, I chose to use a very upfront type of rhythm, combining a vertical turning effect of images of the sky through the day as a metaphor for the emotions. And these were to also reflect the random results of a slot machine.
You were my neighbour all this winter, Mr. Sky. When I left my house, you were trying to impress me in your best shirt, all pink patterned with aubergine. Silks and satins with a new tie of rainbow. On Sunday you wore gold trimmed with magenta. You were the bold one, Mr. Sky. When it rained for 7 days, even then you cheered me. Your workaday suit was iridescent. A pigeon's breast never shimmered like you did. Two-tone mauve and lavender and grey, like the softest wool socks. Smoke in my fireplace and smoke in my eyes. I opened my door for you, Mr. Sky. I loved you, but you were the mad one. When I locked you out after a late binge, you threw the moss off the roof tiles. You rattled the window and kicked at the door latch. I was so afraid I slept in the cupboard, wrapped in the cat's blanket. I couldn't keep my drink. Could I, Mr. Sky? But in the morning, I was sober and guilty. When I opened the curtains, there you were, your face pressed to the window, you, all pink fresh and sweet smelling, you in your best gold and aubergine, silk and satin with a new tie for sunrise.
Yes, so the soundscape is often critical in poetry films, and some filmmakers begin with the soundscape before the poem. Mark Naze is a good example. There are many ways to make a poetry film, in collaboration or alone, in a large group even. Here is an example of a short film with a sublime soundscape where less is more, and we focus on the textures of life and the words themselves. Although the text is very minimal, it creates a great deal of drama, each word arriving with a sense of what will happen next. This film is In Silence by Charles Olsen. Or we can use music in a surprising way. And the film that illustrates that, I feel, is Dave Bonter's On Hold. The music and the action on screen make a wonderful marriage.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing those films and those insights. A really great illustration, I think, of the diversity of the form. So, to kind of summarise, it seems to me that there are three central themes that run through the book. That although artists themselves are key, your emphasis is always on the how, the form of the poetry films. And perhaps, secondly, that although this is often a collaborative medium, it's ideal for expressing individual subjectivity. And as I think you put it in the book, for sharing silenced voices. And then thirdly, that the book is also a very important vehicle for your specialism, which is the philosophy of poetry film. I noticed that you open the book with a quote from Barbara Rubin, which I'm just going to read here. "We are going through the reflection age, living through subjective reflections," which I think is a great epigraph. Could you say something about how it encapsulates the approach that you've developed to the study of the poetics of poetry film?
Yes, I love that quote. It was so ahead of its time when it was said in 1967. In terms of subjectivity, whilst the book does discuss lots of different types of poetry film, at the centre of this is the author, and this makes the poetry film different to other types of short film. The medium is ideal for expressing subjectivity, lyric subjectivity particularly, and in a way this plays into the rise of the subject in the world that we're living in today, where it's possible to have both a personal and a political voice, and particularly in your art to send out strong messages, such as the work of Helen Moore and Howard Vors. Spoken word artists are very good at bringing their own voices into the political arena, and Holly McNish is one fine example of this with her much needed film Embarrassed.
I thought it was okay. I could understand the reasons. They said there might be a man or a nervous child seeing this small piece of flesh that they weren't quite expecting. So I whispered and tiptoed with nervous discretion. But after 6 months of her life sat sitting on lids, sipping on milk, nostrils sniffing on piss, trying not to bang her head on toilet roll dispensers, I wonder whether these public loo feeds offend her. I'm getting tired of discretion and being polite. As my baby's first sips are drowned, drenched in shite, I spent the first feeding months of her beautiful life feeling nervous and awkward and wanting everything right. Surrounded by family till I stepped out the house. It took me 8 weeks to get the confidence to go into town. Now the comments around me cut like a knife as I rush into toilet cubicles feeling nothing like nice. Because I'm giving her milk that's not in a bottle. Wishing the cocaine generation white powder would topple. I see pyramid sales pitches across our green globe and female breasts banned, unless they're out just for show. And the more I go out, the more I can't stand it. I walk into town, feel I'm surrounded by bandits, because in this country are billboards covered in tits and family newsagent magazines full of it. W.H. Smith top shelves out for men, why don't you complain about them then? In this country of billboards covered in tits and family newsagent magazines full of it. W.H. Smith top shelves out for men. I'm getting embarrassed in case a small flash of flesh might offend. And I am not trying to parade this. I don't want to make a show. But when I'm told I'd be better just staying at home. And when another friend I know is thrown off a bus and another mother told to get out of a pub, even my grandma said maybe I was sexing it up. And I'm sure the milk makers love all this fuss. all the cussing and worry and looks of disgust as another mother turns from nipples to powder, ashamed or embarrassed by comments around her, and as I hold her head up and pull my cardi across and she sips on that liquor made by everyone's God, I think for God's sake Jesus drank it. So did Siddhartha, Muhammad and Moses and both of their fathers, Ganesh and Shiva and Brigid and Buddha, and I'm sure they weren't doing it sniffing on shit as their mothers sat embarrassed on cold toilet lids in a country of billboards covered in tits. In a country of low-cut tops, cleavage and skin, in a country of cloth bags and recycling bins, and as I desperately try to take all of this in, I hold her head up. I can't get my head round the anger towards us and not to the sound of lorries offloading formula milk into countries where water runs dripping in filth, in towns where breasts are oases of life, now dried up in 2-for-1 offers enticed by labels and logos and gold standard rights claiming breast milk is healthier, powdered and white, packaged and branded and sold at a price so that nothing is free in this money-fueled life, which is fine if you need it or prefer to use bottles, where water is clean and bacteria boil. But in towns where they drown in pollution and sewage, bottled kids die and they knew that they'd do it. In towns where pennies are savoured like sweets, we are now paying for one thing that has always been free. In towns empty of hospital beds, babies die, diarrhoea-fueled that breast milk would end. So no more will I sit on these cold toilet lids, no matter how embarrassed I feel as she sips. Because in this country of billboards, covered in tits, I think I should try to get used to this.
Theorists never like the individual to be central, as it takes the power away from collective theories. In Russia, formalism suited the state as it was a way of controlling the individual under the guise of a scientific study of language. But in poetry film, we can talk about structure and the subject and political beliefs, and in a way it is there for that.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. There really is a democratising potential within the medium that we need to safeguard and to treasure. But how does that championing of subjectivity connect to your interest in philosophy or the philosophies of poetry film?
At the heart of this book lies what is called connective aesthetics, where an ethical relation is in play. We can no longer exist in a blinkered universe, and artists are sending out very strong messages. For example, in your finely crafted film, Small Journeys Skyward, we can see connective aesthetics in action.
In the belly, dark, with rushlight guttering, we grind, red ochre, yellow ochre, umber, carbon black, bone
lime white, pigment bound with fat and bone, tearing bison, horse, antelope from solar plexus, and dot and line and spiral, serpent form, oval, cross hatch, delivered all metaphor and incantation. In hot fingers, Rosa catches dust, mote by mote, a handful for the gardeners, tattooing the earth, tattooing the skin of the earth. Bones of lava flows, soil and spit, soil and spit, and mud nests. A flowering, mark-making, story showing, tracing relationships, sounding a chord from hand on rock. Hidden in her peck, 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 a remembering, inventing word for feather and flight. Seed dispersal, smart dust, gifts from a small island.
Thank you, Sarah. That's really kind. So as we start to think about winding our conversation up here, I wonder in what ways your research might have changed your approach to making or curating poetry film.
I would say that technology plays a big part in allowing new approaches to making, but you have to be responsive to those opportunities, I guess. My own films aren't consciously related to other contemporary filmmakers' work, but I have certainly absorbed hundreds of extraordinary ideas through this book. Maybe I can't see a link between my films and the work of other people, and others can. I do know, for example, Selfie with Marilyn, though, a recent film from the Visible Poetry Project Commission, is an indirect nod to Leonard Cohen's Poem, the 1967 poetry film with Joseph Reeve. Cohen reads from his novel Beautiful Losers, and against primarily still images. And this film is innovative in that he recites the poem 4 times against different images, including errors, and so that the meaning becomes altered each time. Looking at my film, you wouldn't necessarily see that connection, but I know that it sparked something in my mind and prompted Selfie with Marilyn as you see it. I do have a few films like that, inspired by earlier filmmakers. I mean, I guess it's like anything. The more you're exposed to different media, the more you can move forward in your own work.
My mind seems to go out on a path the width of a thread and of endless length, a thread that is the same color as the night. Out along the narrow highway sails my mind.
Since I began curating poetry films in 2012, they have changed, and the political aspect is coming more and more to the fore, as might be expected today. On the other hand, Zebra recently showed many big budget short films with hair and makeup, etc., that had poetry almost added to them. They were in fact more like wannabe feature films. Of course, as a lone artist, I resist this. It does create a different type of film, I feel. The experimental is really necessary in poetry film, or we will end up with factory farmed filmmaking almost. I will always respond to a mind that has played and delved deep and found kairos, which means the opportunity, the opportune moment for action. And in a poetry film, you can feel that. There are often leaps of the imagination that arise just through the making process. This is hard to do by committee or a production team.
I find the book truly inspiring. And it leaves me wanting to rethink some of my own approaches to making, to voice especially, and also to tracing some of my connections with other makers in diverse contexts. And that led me to think, I wonder what impact you would like the book to have on your readers' thinking.
I'm so glad you said that. I am passionate about this subject, and I would like people to really get to know poetry films and filmmakers from all around the world and see just what is possible in the field today. And also the past, because it still bears a huge importance and relation to the present in the digital arena. And I'm sure Marinetti, more than anyone, would have wished to have been alive today. Whilst the book showcases poetry film and filmmakers, as I said, I think that it also shows that how voice is extremely important today in its various forms, and I would like to inspire people to go out there, make their own poetry films and have a voice effectively. And it can be a beautiful and fascinating narrative or a sublime concept or something you just need to say, but also it can be a philosophical or a political approach to existence that you're really trying to get across. You only really need a mobile phone and an idea, and then the ability to be open to what can come next and where a poem can take you. You work with a friend, work with anyone who, maybe somebody who likes music, and just see what happens. And out of that will come something amazing, I promise you. There are lots of places to share these films today, lots of festivals. And ultimately, I would like the book to inspire more people to enter the field and to further discussion on the subject for the years to come.
It seems to me that you've created a survey of what poetry film is today, and implicit within that, a sense of what poetry film can be in the future. And one of the aspects of studying and making poetry film that excites me is the sense that this is a site under construction. A space, or I often think of it as a landscape, that's just rich in possibilities. The Poetics of Poetry Film, I think, helps us to read that landscape. It helps us to understand how it was formed, its features, its contours, and what it needs to thrive, to sustain its fertility. So for me, it really is an essential guide, and I suspect an industry Bible for years to come. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you, Meriel.